At the end of the 19th century, the United States was being transformed by industrialization. Railroads stitched the continent together, steel mills and oil refineries expanded at breathtaking speed, and giant corporations began to dominate entire sectors of the economy. This growth created enormous wealth, but much of that wealth was concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of industrial and financial titans. Critics of the era called them trust magnates or robber barons, depending on how charitable they were feeling. Men tied to companies like Standard Oil, major railroad systems, and massive holding trusts could influence markets, shape prices, and often pressure government itself. In many states and in Washington, corporate money had extraordinary power. Political machines, campaign donations, patronage, and backroom bargaining helped create a system in which regulation was weak, labor protections were limited, and competition could be strangled before it had a chance to grow. For many ordinary Americans, it felt as if elections alone were not enough to break that cycle. By the 1892s, farmers, workers, reformers, and progressive politicians were all wrestling with the same question. How do you restrain concentrated private power when that power has already seeped into public institutions? Into that crisis stepped Theodore Roosevelt, better known as Teddy Roosevelt, a man whose energy, ambition, and political instincts made him one of the most consequential presidents in American history. Roosevelt had already built a reputation long before reaching the White House. He served as a New York assemblyman, a federal civil service reformer, New York City police commissioner, assistant secretary of the Navy, and a hero of the Spanish-American War after leading the Rough Riders. In 1898, he was elected governor of New York and took office in 1899. That mattered immensely because New York was the financial center of the nation. As governor, Roosevelt pursued a reformist agenda that worried party bosses and major corporate interests. He supported stronger oversight of public utilities and railroads, pushed for labor protections, backed civil service reform, and resisted machine control over state politics. He was a Republican, but not the kind of Republican corporate leaders found comfortably predictable. That made him a problem for the party establishment. In 1900, President William McKinley was running for re-election. McKinley was closely associated with the business wing of the Republican Party, and after the death of Vice President Garrett Hobart, the party needed a new running mate. Roosevelt was immensely popular, but many Republican bosses, especially Senator Thomas Platt of New York, wanted him out of the governorship. The vice presidency seemed like the perfect place to sideline him. At that time, the office was widely viewed as politically unimportant, a ceremonial dead end rather than a center of power. Roosevelt himself was not thrilled, but he accepted the nomination. McKinley and Roosevelt won the election of 1900. Then history took a dramatic turn. In September 1901, McKinley was shot by anarchist Leon Czolgosz at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, and died days later. Roosevelt, only 42 years old, became president, the youngest person ever to assume the office at that time. What had been intended as a move to neutralize him instead elevated him to the highest office in the country. Roosevelt entered the presidency facing entrenched power on all sides. Congress was hardly free from corporate influence, and the largest trusts had resources beyond anything most politicians could imagine. Yet Roosevelt did not charge at every large company at once. One of his great political strengths was that he understood the difference between attacking size itself and attacking abuse. He argued that not every big corporation was inherently bad. In his view, some combinations were efficient and legitimate. The real problem was what he called bad trust, corporations that used monopoly power, discriminatory pricing, corruption, and predatory tactics to crush rivals and exploit the public. That distinction was politically brilliant. It reassured moderates, split the business community, and made it harder for all large firms to unite against him. His first great target was the Northern Securities Company, a giant railroad holding company formed in 1901 by powerful financiers including J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill. Northern Securities effectively combined control over major rail lines in the Northwest and was seen by many as a blatant attempt to eliminate competition. Roosevelt's administration sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, a law that had existed for years but had been used weakly and inconsistently. In 1904, the Supreme Court, by a narrow 5-4 decision, ordered the company dissolved. The margin mattered. A single vote the other way could have weakened the federal government's ability to challenge trust at a crucial moment. Instead, the decision sent shockwaves through the country. It proved that the federal government could act against concentrated corporate power and actually win. That case made Roosevelt famous as a trust buster, though the nickname can oversimplify what he was doing. He was not trying to destroy capitalism. He was trying to bring powerful corporations under public law. Over the course of his presidency, his administration brought more than 40 antitrust actions, far more than McKinley had. One of the most important later cases involved Standard Oil, whose business practices had long been criticized for secret rebates, price discrimination, and intimidation of competitors. Roosevelt also pursued cases involving major meatpacking and railroad interests. The point was not random aggression. It was to establish that no corporation, no matter how rich or politically connected, was beyond federal scrutiny. Railroads were especially important because they were the arteries of the industrial economy. Control over freight rates could make or break entire businesses. Secret rebates and preferential treatment allowed powerful firms to pay lower shipping costs than their competitors, distorting the market. Standard Oil became notorious for securing favorable arrangements that smaller rivals could not match. Roosevelt pushed for stronger federal regulation through measures like the Elkins Act of 1903, which targeted railroad rebates, and later the Hepburn Act of 1906, which significantly strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission by allowing it to set maximum railroad rates. These reforms did not emerge because Congress suddenly became pure. They passed because Roosevelt exploited divisions among corporate interests, built public pressure, and used the presidency as a bully pulpit. He understood that rival factions within business often wanted government to curb the excesses of their competitors. That was one of Roosevelt's greatest talents. He could turn the system's fractures into opportunities for reform. He used publicity masterfully, appealing directly to the public and framing issues in moral terms the country could understand. He also knew when to negotiate. Some corporations, seeing the direction of events, preferred cooperation to confrontation. Roosevelt's relationship with U.S. Steel is a famous example of his more flexible approach. He was capable of distinguishing between firms he believed could be supervised and firms he believed had to be challenged head-on. His broader philosophy came to be called the square deal, the idea that government should ensure fairness among labor, business, and the public rather than simply serving the strongest interests. Roosevelt's reform record extended beyond antitrust. He intervened in the 1902 coal strike, pressuring owners to negotiate rather than automatically siding with management, which was a major departure from earlier presidential behavior. After public outrage over conditions in the meatpacking industry, his administration backed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. He also became a pioneer of conservation, setting aside vast tracts of land, creating national forests, and expanding the federal role in protecting natural resources. All of this reflected the same underlying belief. Modern industrial society required an energetic national government strong enough to serve the public interest. It is true that Roosevelt did not defeat every monopoly and did not purge corporate influence from American politics. Many powerful interests survived him, and later presidents, especially William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, will continue antitrust enforcement in different ways. But Roosevelt changed expectations. Before him, many Americans assumed that concentrated wealth was simply too entrenched to challenge. After him, it was harder to claim that the federal government was helpless. He demonstrated that the presidency could be used as an active instrument of reform, that public opinion could be mobilized against abusive private power, and that even the richest corporations could be forced into court. That is why Theodore Roosevelt remains such a compelling figure. At a time when vast fortunes seemed to dominate the political system, he refused to act intimidated. He was not perfect, and historians still debate many parts of his legacy, but on the question of confronting entrenched economic power, he fundamentally altered the balance. He recognized that the danger was not merely wealth, but wealth fused with political influence and shielded from accountability. Then he did something rare. He used strategy, law, public pressure, and sheer force of personality to push back. What looked impossible at the start of the century suddenly looked possible because one president proved the system did not have to belong entirely to the trusts.